Thank you, Dr. Richard Bush, for taking this interview with us.
My pleasure.
We have a lot to talk about, so let's just start with the book. So you refer Hong Kong as a political hybrid, yet different from other hybrid conducting elections but suppressing on political reforms. So you call it a liberal oligarchy. What does a liberal oligarchy mean?
Well, it's a good question. I think I invented the term, so let me explain it. What the liberal side means is that Hong Kong, under the Basic Law, protects the rule of law, has an independent judiciary, and protects civil and political rights. This has led Hong Kong to become a very political city. The oligarchy part refers to the concentration of economic and political power in the hands of a fairly small number of people, basically business tycoons. As a result, Hong Kong has become more and more unequal in terms of income, wealth, access to education, access to jobs, access to housing. What Hong Kong people have demanded for a long time is full democracy when it comes to elections, that all senior positions, whether chief executive or in the legislature, be selected by popular elections.
So you do think this kind of imbalance result in the Occupy movement, later on umbrella movement?
Beijing proposed that instead of selecting the chief executive by a small election committee, that the chief executive be picked in popular elections, basically one person, one vote, universal suffrage. But they also insisted that the candidates for that election would be picked by a nominating committee, which in its composition looked very much like the old election committee. And so people said, well, wait a minute, a popular election would be a sham because the elite is going to pick who the candidates are. So there was resistance to this, there were recommendations for changing it, there were demonstrations about it that culminated in the proposals for Occupy Central and then the umbrella movement itself.
So you do think this kind of movement, Occupy Central or umbrella movement, is inevitable?
I do think it was inevitable. I think no one expected the form it actually took, occupying major thoroughfares in Hong Kong for almost 2 months. That was a surprise. That was very different from the original plan for Occupy Central.
You call this movement double tragedy in your book.
Yes. The first way it was a tragedy was that the ultimate outcome, the failure of reform, didn't have to happen. Even though there was a nominating committee, the Hong Kong government proposed some modifications to it that I think would have allowed a competitive election. And that was really what was important. The candidates in the election represent the various parts of the Hong Kong political spectrum, so that pan-democratic voters could have voted for someone who came out of the democratic movement. And the design of the nominating committee would have made it possible for the right kind of democratic politician, somebody moderate, somebody acceptable to Beijing, but still somebody who had democratic values and would work to promote the interests of the middle class and the poor. It was possible for that person to actually run. That required the Democratic camp to be very united. And what we saw during the umbrella movement and through this whole process was that there was a big struggle between moderates on the one hand and radicals on the other. And the radicals, in the end, controlled what the Democratic camp did. So that was one tragedy. You could have had a pretty good reform. The second tragedy is that Hong Kong has a lot of problems, and those problems have to be dealt with in the political system. The problems include the inequality, what to do about the aging population, how to ensure that Hong Kong is competitive going forward, and so on. But if you're going to have a proposal to give greater emphasis in the Hong Kong government to innovation and technology, you have to pass a bill in the LegCo. But it took them 3 years to do that because the LegCo was tied up with filibusters and so on. So this is what happened with the electoral reform is just a much bigger example of that. Because the political system is now so dysfunctional and stalemated. The work that Hong Kong people have a right to expect that their political system will do for them isn't going to get done.
I want to move to the globalization effect in Hong Kong. I quote here, you wrote in the book, Hong Kong's particular growth path over the last decade has widened income inequity to the point that income distribution is more skewed than in most other developed economies, and though has created grievance against the government among those who feel left behind. So I think we're seeing this conflict in this election in the US.
Yes.
So what do you say, what are the similarities and political differences between those economies?
Globalization and its social and economic effects creates a lot of inequality, but it also creates problems for social mobility. The ideal for any family is that the children end up in a better position than their parents were at their best. And that has been quite true through the post-war period. But we're moving into a phase in Hong Kong and lots of other places where young people can reasonably have serious doubts about whether their standard of living is going to be as good as their parents. That's a bad outcome. So in the United States, the blame was put on trade deals like NAFTA and TPP, which is really mechanisms for enhancing globalization. A lot of blame is also put on immigrants who allegedly are taking jobs from the people who are already here. Actually, most immigrants are taking jobs that Americans aren't willing to do or they're not qualified to do. In both Hong Kong and Taiwan, a lot of the blame is put on China, the way in which China is becoming more competitive, leaving them with a not such a favorable economic future. In Hong Kong, it takes some particularly interesting manifestations. So, for example, Hong Kong's had a lot of tourists go to a lot of the malls where there are luxury shops. Other people come from across the border and buy up all the milk powder and so on, and that gets people very angry. More consequential, I think, is that very smart, very talented mainland graduates come to Hong Kong looking for jobs, and they should. Companies should pick the very best talent that they can. That's one of the ways they're competitive. But what it means is that often Hong Kong young people are shut out of those jobs. It adds to the belief that this increasingly unequal society is not working for them. Actually, globalization is not the only cause of all this, but it certainly contributes to it.
So you just gave us a lot of examples about, we see the anecdotes are getting abundant about the deteriorating relationship between the mainlanders and Hong Kongers.
Yes.
So the same thing happened to Taiwan.
Yes.
So is there still a lot of room to improve relations between those two groups?
One of the really interesting things about mainland tourists going to Hong Kong and mainland tourists going to Taiwan is that, these people are not officials, they're not necessarily well educated, and they act not in the civilized way that Hong Kong people and Taiwan people have learned to act. What Hong Kong people and Taiwan people have realized is mainland society is different from our society. So that realization helps to strengthen a sense of identity that is something separate. And so this is an unintended consequence of tourism. I'm sure the mainland government thought that it was doing Hong Kong and Taiwan a favor by sending all these tourists there, but in terms of how the average Taiwan person or the average Hong Kong person viewed it and therefore viewed China, it's not what was expected.
So you talk about all the reasons why things were being like this.
Yes.
Do we have a solution? Do we have either room to improve? From mainland's perspective, or both?
As I suggested, this evolution of people's habits is a long-term proposition. Maybe People in Taiwan and people in Hong Kong have to be a little more tolerant. It's a fact that people around the world had to be tolerant of American tourists. We were actually pretty annoying. The deeper problem is that we now find out that tourism doesn't necessarily benefit the whole society that's receiving the tourists. It benefits the hotels and the bus companies and the taxi drivers and the people who run luxury shops. It may drive up the price of real estate, so it's a mixed blessing.
So it's really hard to, given the fact we still have those domestic conflicts, yet it's really hard for people in Hong Kong to expect Beijing to give them universal suffrage.
Yes.
Is there really working strategy for Hong Kong to feel, a little bit satisfied? What Beijing could do to make Hong Kong people feel their rights somehow still got respected?
I think what may be necessary is for the Hong Kong elite, which has supported the central government, which has benefited from the Hong Kong system that the central government set up, this liberal oligarchy that I'm talking about. Maybe it's time for them to tell their friends in Beijing that the steps you are taking are hurting our society. We need you, first of all, to reaffirm in a serious way your commitment to the rule of law in Hong Kong and the independent judiciary. Second, you need to respect the civil and political rights of people in Hong Kong. You need to pledge that mainland law enforcement authorities will not come across the border and seize people. That pledge has been made in a low-key sort of way, but it has to be made in a more forthright way. If you continue to take back the most precious things that you gave us in the basic law, we can't predict what's going to happen, and managing the Hong Kong problem on your part will get harder and harder and harder.
Let's talk about the chief executive selection. So in the wake of the selection in March 2017, what additional reforms are necessary to ensure Hong Kong's economic competitiveness, you mentioned the book, and improve its governance?
With respect to economic competitiveness, Hong Kong has always been very skillful in identifying where to deploy its resources to maintain economic growth. And as China gets stronger economically, that's not always been easy. It may require changes in the law, changes in the regulations. Let me give you an example. Hong Kong's an aging society just like Taiwan and to an extent the United States. The demand for healthcare services is going to go up a lot. The supply of people to provide those services and institutions to provide those services is probably lacking at this point. So there's a great opportunity here. However, the rules concerning who can practice as a physician in Hong Kong are pretty strict. If you're a foreign doctor, it's really hard.
That including doctors from mainland?
I think so, yeah, from anywhere. This is good for doctors in Hong Kong because it reduces the competition, right?
Yeah.
But perhaps now it's time to liberalize those rules. There's probably potential in expanding the freedom of the private side of the medical system and having better integration between the public side and the private side. I think one of the most important things for any advanced economy to do is to examine whether its education system is producing people with the skills that are needed for the future economy. Maybe we probably all need more engineers and need to create incentives for training engineers. Finally, I think that it's important to attack the inequality problem through changes in the taxation system, the welfare system, and so on.
What kind of candidates will emerge, and who are Beijing's favorites among them in terms of the election next year?
There are lots of rumors that the finance secretary, John Zhang, is going to run. I don't know if he is or not. He comes from a somewhat different background, has had different set of responsibilities than the chief executive. Another name that you've heard is Jasper Zhang, the past president of the Legislative Council, who I think has a much better sense of the popular feeling and the popular mood and what should be the focus of attention and what shouldn't. Another name you hear is Regina Yip, who was a member of the civil service for a long time, had a variety of jobs, but she's now a legislator. So, there are, several well-qualified candidates. They're not exactly the same as each other in terms of their background, their skills, and what they will emphasize. So there will be a certain amount of choice. Then it's possible, if the Pan-Democrats and the localists get enough seats in the election committee, that they could put forward one of their own to run. We've had, in the last two CE elections, there's actually been a Democratic candidate. Never got enough votes, was not really competitive, but it did offer a choice of some kind.
All right, thank you.
Sure. No, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Richard.